Black people that exist in sort of like the communities you go is when you get to the city, Saint Denis, which is based on New Orleans. And there, you know, I when I was doing research for this paper, I kind of delved into like this whole thing, like New Western history. It's all these scholars who are trying to recover all this information about the way that that Blacks were all over the West, and that's not the story that's told. And then so the question became for me, well, why is that not the story that's told, and why is this sort of like idealistic, very white, very male version of the American West? I mean, and even this idea of the West is kind of like has a slippery definition. But why is that the story that continues to be told when we know that's not really how the West really was, right? I found out about towns like Nicodemus and Blackdom, which are all Black towns founded by Black people who were fleeing Jim Crow and other things, and literally existed for years, for decades, hundreds of years, some of them, and they're just completely written out of history. And that can't be like a mistake, right? So why is it that we don't learn more about that? That has to be attached to, in my view, the goals of the nation. And part of that is perpetuating a particular version of the American origin story.
I have a question. Thank you, Regina. This was amazing. I'm so glad I got to listen. I'm not a gamer in any sense, but I'm curious, are there any games that you've seen that are starting to do this better? Or is it just because of how like the tech culture and gamer culture works, it's just a huge kind of gap, and that like no one's doing it well or even slightly better?
Well, so that's a complicated question, right? Because the first thing was like, there are a few, you know, but they were like, there's not enough Black people in video games. And so that you know, was remedied by placing Black characters in video games, but all these characters are extremely violent, extremely stereotypical. Like, I love Grand Theft Auto, but man, every time I see CJ or Franklin, I'm like, this is a mess. This keep me from playing it, so I'm guilty. But like many of us who we engage in all kinds of American media, that we can see the stereotypes within them, and we still, you know, watch or listen or whatever. The thing that I want, though, is not just more Black bodies taking up space, or not really, right, in video games. I want, you know, characters that have, you know, real plot lines and are fully imagined human beings as much as any video game character can be. There is one character, and I think it's Wolfenstein too. Kishana, you can hop in this if you remember, which I was not able to play to the end. Something about it just didn't work with me. But there is a character, it's a Black woman character who is like, I think she's the boss of the main character. And she's really powerful and amazing. But again, that's the game where lots of people are being killed too, right? A lot of games are games where lots of Black people lots of people in general are being killed. And so, you know, it's a complicated question. You know, I don't think it's good just to have, you know, characters, you know, that are Black just floating around. I think it's important to imbue them with the same kinds of humanness that the white characters are imbued with, I guess is the short answer. I see a question from Frank here in the chat. So what about pro sports videos? Do they suffer from the same failures? And they do. I mean, so they suffer from other kinds of issues, right? I had a piece that I really wanted to write in this paper, but it didn't fit. But it was about the way that even the video game representations of sports players, like from Madden to like you know, NBA 2K, like those are not meant to be actual people. Like they are game representations of athletes, but we don't see our athletes as human beings, right? They are like tools of our entertainment, right? They are kind of like, they exist in another kind of representational world. And so the video game is just another version of that, right? And they all the players worry about are their stats. And they tried to actually add a narrative part into, I think it was NBA 2K20. And so I didn't get a chance to play it. So I try not to write about games that I haven't played. But you know, I wouldn't make the argument that the avatars you maneuver around in a sports game are human or imbued with the same kind of humanness as I wouldn't make that argument, right? And of course, because a lot of the popular sports figures are African American, many of the avatars that you can manipulate in these sports games are as well. So it's like before there were Black characters in any other kinds of games, except for like one Black character in most of the fighting games, right? Like that one guy in Street Fighter who was like Afro-Brazilian and did like his fighting style was like capoeira, you know, or whatever. Like aside from things like that, most of the Black bodies that were created in video games were in the sports game. So that's a problem in and of itself, right? So
I have one more question. I'm
Oh,
so,
go ahead.
I can, okay. I'm sorry. Last question from me. I just wondered, Regina, if you had any thoughts on how the participatory aspect of game media, like games, how that potentially differs from like more audience as static, just viewer media. Does that make sense?
yes, it does. And I talked a little bit about that. There was a part of this paper that I wanted to write on Adewale, who is the main character of Freedom Cry, which was like a downloadable content addition to Assassin's Creed 4. And he's a character that, a Black character who was like part of the Assassin's Guild or whatever, but he's a slave he ran away from being a slave. He freed himself basically, killed his owner and became kind of like a pirate and assassin. And he is shipwrecked back on, I think it's Haiti, Guadeloupe. Saint Domingo. Don't get me. I'm an English professor. Don't do me. And the whole game is him like going around like freeing slaves, trying to help the Maroons fight on this island. And I was thinking about writing a paper about the participatory elements of that, like how there might be some elements of catharsis for Black players. But I think that like the participatory aspects they were good and bad, right? So if you, like we all know, anybody who plays games, right? They know that there are particular players who all they want to do is manipulate Black bodies and have entree or access to particular spaces, Black spaces that they wouldn't normally. So there are ways in which participatory aspect of video games can make a lot of the worst versions of racism even worse. There are ways in which there's an element of control with that too, an element of being able to move differently in some of these spaces, but you're not going to win the game if you move too differently, right? Like, even though the main character Arthur in Red Dead 2 is supposed to be a good guy, and the narrative leads us to believe that, well, you can play him as a Black hat too. So, right, are you going to be the Arthur that's going around killing women and children and shooting Native Americans, or are you going to be the Arthur that's pulling over to the side of the road and helping people put shoes on their horses, right? So I think that's a fascinating like path to go down. I just don't know how to track something like that, right? That's a rambly answer to say participatory aspect of this is very important. I just don't know quite what to say about it, right? I think it depends on the game and the player. And you see a lot of this though when you play online, which I try not to do because there's a lot of things that are scary on there. Like lots of, I don't want to be called the N-word while I'm trying to, collect cigarette cards. I don't need that. But anyway.
So there's a question in the chat by Professor Jones. I don't know if you want to do that one first, and I can ask mine.
For sure. Do you know if the presence of the supposed Black bodies in video games has impacted the marketing? Yes. I mean, I think it affected it a lot. I think that seeing a person like even Franklin back in the day. That game was set in LA. Lots of LA people love that game. And people who wish they could live in LA don't also love that game. But seeing Franklin as being the only main character, I think was very interesting and perhaps seductive to Black players. But I think that game obviously crossed the line between giving you a glimpse and being able to sort of live in the shoes of somebody that reminded you of people you know, and just being a complete, like, terrible stereotype. And you know, and I think it's clear. I mean, if you Google like Grand Theft Auto, 9 million, you know, scholarly articles about race and GTA pop up. It's very clear that game is beyond what we think of as reasonable for portrayals of like a Black human being in media. It's not surprising and it's familiar, but it's still problematic. So, I mean, there's still lots of people bought that game though. All right, Ari, are you next? This chat's going off over here. Okay.
Right. So I'm just slide in real quick and then
Okay.
I'm gonna dip out. So thank you so much, Professor Hamilton, for this illuminating discussion. I'm thinking a lot about some conversations that I'm in theoretically right now that really center a lot of Jennifer Nash's work and Samantha Pinto's Infamous Bodies recently, and even Sabrina String's Fearing the Black Body, which is really about the ways that like Black people are positioned around this like conversation of humanness or humanity, and how, you know, is it even productive to have that conversation? And so, and in my own work, I think about the ways that, you know, we keep asking representation to do this work that is about seeing Blackness in all of its complexity on screens, or in literature or whatever. And I'm just wondering, like, can you talk a little bit about like why we still need to fight this particular fight? Like, why not let them just be gangsters and whoever they are? Or even to your point about like the sports games, like if they're already not supposed to be human-like, right? Which we can argue avatars are not really, especially in a gaming environment, are supposed to be something else. Like, why even fight for this like particular type of varied representation?
Those are all very good questions. And you know, I'm an English professor, so I go back always to the narrative, right? And the narratives that we tell and that have been told to us, they have power. And I think one of the main ways that we can change the future is by changing the narratives, right? And I think that these games, they're no longer like Sonic, you know, hopping over some things and rolling around that little thing that's like a loop-de-loop, right? These games have become like moving narratives. Like they have become, like when I play, you know, my partner watches it like a movie while I'm playing, right? And you can literally do that. And I think that we've been having a conversation a long time about representation of Blackness in media. We know that certain kinds of representation has real effects on the way people understand themselves and understand the world around them. And I think that, you know, my opinion on this is that we have to start really looking at the kinds of narratives that are being pushed forward in video games, because that's the newest American media and it's going to be here. Like, video game market is out of control. It's hundreds, billions of dollars every year people are spending on these games. And I just think it's important that in the newest media that we're not retelling old stories, flawed stories about who is human and who is not. And so, you know, the problem, I think, is that, you know, the people who control the means of producing these games are not interested in telling those stories. And so kind of as answering, I think that was maybe a question of Katie's too, but like, you know, the distribution companies and these big like AAA plus titles, I mean, those games they're not interested. They are very happy to maintain a legibility of Blackness and of Black bodies as just the stereotypes that are easily pulled in, right? They're maneuverable. And I think that we have to, you know, at least be cognizant of the way that we're being led to believe certain things and to reinscribe certain ideas in our media. So I think the conversation is important. You know what I mean? There is